Hello everyone, we are Group 1 and today we're going to be presenting about the exploration of homophily in freshmen, specifically in the context of SUTD's freshman year and the class of 2022. So now moving on to the table of contents, this is just a summarization of what we're going to be going through today. And our team consists of Chavi from ESD, Asfar, and myself, Benjamin, from EPD, as well as James from CSD. Moving on to the hypotheses of our group's project, we started thinking about what we wanted to do, and something that just came up in casual passing was on the topic of our capstone groups, at least for the Term 7 people, and why we chose the groups that we chose. So this got us started in the direction of wondering how often people would actually stick to grouping with the same people in their group projects across terms. The classroom dynamic lays the foundation for the birth of a social-centric network, as coined by Charles Kadushin, and a common goal is created between group members when we gather within our project groups. This, in turn, fosters a sense of connection amongst the members as they tackle all the challenges together. Now, we believe that a homophilous relationship is thus formed amongst all the members from this experience, and we expect to see a significant retention rate amongst students in choosing their group members across terms, if given the choice, of course. However, this does not necessarily extrapolate to the rest of the other students in the school, and we wanted to see whether this hypothesis was actually true or not.
Now, we will discuss about a data collection and analysis process in relation to our hypothesis. To do this, we simply take the groupings from the modules 3007 and 10009. We picked 3007 because it is the first major general whole cohort course in a student's journey that allows free choosing of teammates. 10009 because it is the second major course in the freshman curriculum that allows free choosing of teammates, and it is just after 3007 since 3007 was conducted on term 2 and 10009 was conducted on term 3. Data is collected for the class of 2022 batch since this is the last batch that allowed free groupings of choice in SUTD for these two batch-wide courses. Do take note that the results of this study might not be applicable for batches from class of 2024 onwards due to SUTD's revamped freshman curriculum. As shown on screen, the 3007 groupings were obtained from SUTD eDimension LMS, while the 10009 groupings were obtained from the Google Sheets that was linked from the Piazza forum post. We can consider each person as a node or vertex in the respective group composition graph of the two modules. If two persons are in the same group for either subject, they would then be connected by an undirected, unweighted edge. By plotting the groupings using Graphviz, we can obtain the diagrams on the screen. Afterwards, we conduct our analysis by considering the graph edit distance, or GED for short, between the two graphs formed. Just to illustrate, as shown on the screen, the GED from the 3007 groupings graph to an empty graph is 1700, while the GED from the 10009 groupings graph to an empty graph is 1718. This measure is then normalized into a percentage by comparing them against two chosen benchmarks, the empty graph and the complement graph of the groupings graphs. By obtaining this percentage value, we can get a more intuitive and concrete measure on how similar these two graphs are. An important point to note here is that the GED from 3007 to 10009 and from 10009 to 3007 are ever so slightly different. This was because we used an approximation algorithm that attempts to solve this NP-hard problem in polynomial time. The exact algorithm took much longer than expected, and since the discrepancy is just 2 edit points, we deem it to be acceptable enough. By using the GED values and comparing them against the chosen benchmarks, we can get the teammate retention rate between 3007 and 10009. More specifically, if we average out the percentages against the different benchmarks, we can get an average of 62.9% for the teammate retention rate. This means, on average, about 3 members of a 5-member group are the same people within the same groups in both 3007 and 10009. Of course, there are many limitations of this study, some of which we should briefly discuss. Admittedly, for one, the grouping data between 3007 and 10009 are actually not identical. Here are the count plots for the group members. As we can see, the group compositions are clearly different. 3007 had 400 students in 77 groups, while 10099 had 411 students in 80 groups. This discrepancy is actually not that surprising, considering that some polytechnic students might have been excused from taking 3007 since they have taken a similar course in their polytechnics and obtaining an A grade. Additionally, some students in later years might need to retake the 10009 course, and thus they join the class of 2022 batch count. As such, measuring group compositions by GED alone might not be accurate enough to capture the true teammate retention rate value. GED itself might not be the best approach to measure teammate retention rate. Feel free to discuss or suggest other possible ways to measure teammate retention rate during our Q&A session. Additionally, it might not be accurate to average out the various GED values that we obtained before. For instance, the complement graph benchmark might be more accurate and meaningful than comparing against the empty graph benchmark. Various assumptions are also being made here, one of which was that all pairs of groupmates possess identically close and mutual relationships, identified by the undirected, unweighted edges. This is definitely not accurate to reality, since some groupmate connections can be stronger than other groupmate connections. For more discussion, you can visit the repository link shown on screen.
Now that we have gone through the results, we can start to analyze the reasons why an individual may or may not stay within a group. First, let's look at the reasons why they would want to stay. During 3007, the school imposed a few constraints on groups. Some of these constraints included a mixture of at least one different educational background and one member of a different gender in the group. This was to promote heterophilia in the group. This ensured that the group was not narrowing its vision during the design process. When the group started working together, however, the idea of we intention plays an important role in the success and therefore the retention rate. We intention is defined by Christy Chung as a commitment of an individual to engage in joint action and involves an implicit or explicit agreement between the participants to engage in that joint action. In this case, the agreement between members to engage in actions that lead to a successful project allows them to work towards a common goal. This facilitates more close bonds being formed between members, which could mean a higher retention rate. Once these bonds have been formed, individuals become more familiar with each other. This familiarity means they will be willing to be more open and honest in their communication between members. Good communication can go a long way in a successful project and as such might translate to an increase in retention rates. Finally, there may be results-oriented individuals who, despite not forming very close bonds with each other, may have identified some members as having contributed to a high grade that the group has achieved. In this case, if the goal was to maximize results, these individuals may end up in the same groups. I will now pass my time to Chavi, who will talk about the reasons why people might not want to stay in a group.
Now we will look at some results on why people might not choose to stay in the same groups. Within a design group, an imbalance between leaders and followers would naturally lead to group not being cohesive enough. For example, too many leaders would result in too many strong opinions and no unanimously agreed goal to work towards the group's common interests, which would eventually affect group's performance across various projects. Homophily may not be the ideal option for the group, as being surrounded by people who are all the same will not provide a space for newer perspectives for critical problem solving skills. Then the scope's depth becomes quite shallow. Furthermore, if the groups are made up of friends, this could lead to a distraction from the project goals, lack of enthusiasm, and emotional exhaustion, as maintaining friendships may become tough and possible conflicts arise. Moreover, similar characteristics may have drawn the team members together at first, but differing morals drove them apart. Surface homophily, for example, talking to individuals to get a sense of who they are on the surface. But as the relationship between two people deepens, they realize they're actually quite different. Lastly, because the course requirements for 3007 and 10009 were quite different and covered a vastly different range of topics, it is not necessary for one group that worked well together in 3007 to do so in 10009 as well. as students usually form groups with those they believe will be able to add value and have similar strengths. Now I will pass my time to Ben, who will take us through the conclusion.
Okay, so now on to the conclusion of our project, and what does this all really tell us? So based on Kadushin's theories, he says that our networks help us to find connections, and it is these connections that give us the abilities to gain access to certain opportunities so that we can be socially mobile. Now in the context of the group's findings, the multidisciplinary nature of the 3007 module naturally causes people to want to network in order to connect with others with varying skill sets, due to the perceived gains from doing so. This agrees with Kadushin's concept of mutuality, which implies that relations are reciprocal, and they involve a give and take between parties, as you can see there from the quote below. The results from our experiment were actually lower than expected, but it still agrees with our hypothesis, and it can be really boiled down to how there was a need within the 3007 module to find differing skill sets. And by the time 10009 came around, people already knew which familiar faces to look for in creating their groups, even when the need to network was still present for a fundamentally different project. And on that note, this concludes our whole presentation and video. I hope you enjoyed listening to us, so thank you very much for listening.